Welcome to Tikvah Radio Show, The Sound of Hope. I'm Liliana Inez, your host. Someone once said that God speaks to people in different ways. Did you ever have dreams, visions, or a special experience in which you felt God was speaking to you? The Torah tells us that Abraham, Jacob, and many others heard and experienced God. Does Adonai speak to people like that nowadays? On Tikvah Radio, we interview people who have had an encounter with the God of Israel, a special experience. Some have even had personal miracles, and all have found the Messiah of Israel. Stay tuned to Tikvah Radio Show and hear an amazing story of someone who was encountered by God. Welcome, Mishpaha. Today our guest is Abraham Chester. Welcome to Tikvah Radio Show, Abraham. We're so glad to have you here with us.
It is good to be here.
Abraham, you have a wonderful way of starting your day. Can you share that with us?
Sure. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one.
That's wonderful. I feel God's presence when you're singing that. I understand that you were raised in a religious Jewish upbringing. Can you tell us what that was like?
Well, everything was surrounded around the synagogue. We went to Temple Beth David. As a child, I went through Hebrew school for 8 years. All I remember is having Jewish friends. And so everything that we did was connected with our synagogue.
So that was really wonderful. However, when you went into school, you had a rude awakening. Can you tell us about what you went through?
Yes, I was around 10 or 11. I was in the 4th grade at Barker Elementary School in Garden Grove, California, Orange County. And for the first time, I heard someone said to me, "You're a Christ killer and a Jew boy, and I hate you." And I didn't know what to do, so I started crying, and I went to the principal. Principal called my mother. Mother came in and said, "That's exactly why I told you don't hang around Gentiles. This is exactly why I told you. Don't listen to what they have to say." My mother drilled into me that those who were not Jewish hated the Jewish people, and they would say derogatory names, and that they didn't like us at all. And so I disassociated myself with anybody who was not Jewish. So I had select friends that my mother approved of, my mother and father approved of, that I could hang around with or play with, and they were all associated with our synagogue.
So did you ever, when you were in Hebrew school, as far as your education about God, did anybody talk to you about if you could connect with God in a personal way? Was there any talk about, besides learning things of your Hebrew roots, was there anything having to do with connecting with God in a personal way?
No, I can't say that. However, we were taught many prayers that we would pray from the Jewish Union prayer book, which I still have with me here. And wonderful prayers, most of them were from the scriptures themselves. But I never really felt that anybody, including my rabbi, ever really talked about having a relationship or a personal encounter or to know God in a personal way. That was never addressed at any time that I was in Hebrew school or, for that matter, attending synagogue. However, I do have to say that there was a tremendous amount of respect on the Sabbath, Shabbat, when they would open up the scrolls and everybody had an opportunity to touch the Torah. So that, I believe, was a wonderful respect of God, although I couldn't say that I had any type of relationship in a personal way.
So you believed in God going through school, Hebrew school. You believed that he was real.
Oh, absolutely. There is no question about the fact that, as I just alluded to in my song and also from the scriptures, they're in Deuteronomy 6:4, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." So it was drilled into me from as far as I can remember as a youth that there is only one God, and he is the creator of the universe. He's the king, and we are to pay special attention, paying homage as well as a fear. But I didn't quite understand what that really was.
So as a child, your personal thoughts about God, when you were thinking about God, how did you picture him?
Well, funny you should say that or ask that. My concept or my picture of God I had in a very vivid dream. And in the dream, I was running to this light. And when I finally got to the end of the tunnel, I saw what I thought looked like God sitting on a majestic throne. All I couldn't see the face, but I saw white hair, and I saw this divine person sitting on a throne looking at me, but I couldn't see his face. And that was probably when I was, I would say 11, 12, maybe 13 years old, before I was bar mitzvahed. But I still remember it like it happened a few moments ago. So there was no question in my mind as a child, being raised in my family, that everything that we did was surrounded around the religion of Judaism, the keeping of the festivities of Judaism, the Sabbath, and the fact that there is only one God. I told my rabbi and my parents about it, but they just kind of put it underneath the pillow, if you want to say. So nothing was ever discussed, but I remembered it was my dream. I know what I saw, and it stayed with me all these years.
Did you feel like God was trying to talk to you?
Absolutely. No question about it. I believe that the prophets of old, Joshua and all the other leaders of the past, even today, I believe that God can speak to people through his word, the majestic word of God. I believe that he can speak to us in visions and dreams, just like the book of Joel talks about. So there was no question in my mind that this was a real dream, and I saw a majestic being, and I don't remember what was actually said in the dream. All I remember is what I saw. There must have been something said. I just don't remember what that was, but it did leave a tremendous impact on my life. It gave me a clearer picture of what it meant to have this holy fear of God, not in the way that God was like had a sledgehammer and was going to hit me every time I did something wrong or committed a sin, but that I was to fear him in awe and respect him. And although I didn't understand what that meant at the time, I realized many years later how it all made sense. But needless to say, it was an experience for me that caused me to really think about what was truth. Is there really a true God? Does he really love me? And so those questions all throughout my young adult life continue to refresh itself as I continue to live my life. But I think that one experience has never left me, and I've never forgotten about it. And it's probably was the real reason why I think God was trying to awaken me and tell me something. I just didn't hear it yet.
Okay. So you were sensing, you were getting a confirmation that there is a real God, and he came to visit you personally.
Correct.
So that is huge.
It is huge.
And you weren't, like the son of a rabbi or somebody super special that, you might think might have something like that happen to you. You're just an ordinary 11-year-old boy. So what I'm hearing is God can visit any one of us, and that he cares about connecting
Absolutely.
With people.
There's no question there. I believe if a person is sincere in seeking after the Holy One, I believe that God can reveal himself to an individual in a variety of different ways, whether it be a vision or a dream, whether it be someone giving them a word. It could be something that they're reading in the Holy Scriptures. God can speak in a variety of different ways, and he can visit anybody he wants to at any time. So that experience in my life has helped me tremendously to hold on to the fact and beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is a God, one true God. And I have to make sure that everyone that's listening to, there is only one true God.
So now, do you feel like at the time, at 11 years old, you were seeking God? Or was that like something further, you were in another zone?
No, I remember my mother taking me to regular public school. And I remember after school was over, she would drive me to the Hebrew school, our synagogue, and I would be there for several hours. And I remember always asking the rabbi or cantor questions concerning who God was, but they really never gave me a clear-cut answer to my questions. And so there was always this lingering question that was unanswered, even by those who I considered my mentor. And I believe that was what got me going, got me thinking, could it be true? Could I have a relationship with God? Or was it just a religion? Or was it just something that happened in the stories of the Tanakh? So yes, I would say that really helped me think about spiritual matters and whether or not I could personally have this relationship, just like the sages of old, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Wow. That's huge, because you're just 11 years old and you're asking these questions. People that taught you in the synagogue were not able to give you an answer, but God heard you to this 11-year-old and gave you this wonderful dream and was reaching out to you because you were asking, and he answered you. He began to answer you through that dream. That's really huge.
Yes, it is huge.
Yeah. So did that change anything for you as a teenager? Anything happened to you as a teenager? As far as your
I do remember
connection with God?
Well, as a teenager, I realized that I had a lot of questions that were not being answered. And so in the library in my mother and father's house is what is referred to as a Masoretic text, which would be similar to the Tanakh. There are 39 books in it, but it is more of a commentary from rabbis and others that explains some of the verses or texts that are in the scriptures. And so I dug that out and I began to read it. And I did have questions that the rabbis just couldn't answer. And the one lingering question continued to come up: could I have a personal relationship with the creator of the universe? And they glossed over it, they being the rabbis, saying that we couldn't. And I wondered why, after having this dream and this encounter, if all of the sages of old had relationships with God, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all the major and minor prophets, and even the children of Israel, heard the voice of God, why couldn't I even as an 11, 12-year-old person and even a young adult, why couldn't I have the same thing? And so I wondered whether or not this was true or not. But for some reason, I just wasn't getting the answers to my questions. But as I began to go over the scriptures, even at the synagogue, I noticed that the liturgy and the reading of the Torah repeats itself every year. And at the end of the time of the readings of the Torah, it's referred to as Simchat Torah, which is a completion of the first 5 books of Moses. But it repeated itself over and over again. But no one really got into the prophets of old. And so I wondered whether or not there could be a Messiah, a deliverer, like Moses, who would deliver me from my sins. Because on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, I never felt forgiven or cleansed or washed. I felt there was a connection, but it wasn't personal. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. There was something there, but it wasn't a personal connection with God. And when you had that dream, God was saying to you, yes, you can have a personal connection with me.
That was the most riveting thing that occurred in my young childhood that cannot be erased. I'm 61 now. That was literally, a little less than 50 years ago. So why would God allow that to happen to me as a young child, and for it not to have some sort of significance in my life later on?
Yeah, that's huge. You went on and you attended university. I know something special happened during that time. Can you share a little bit about your university experience?
Long Beach State University, Long Beach, California. And my goal at the time was to be a journalist. And so I was a sophomore at Long Beach State, and I was in one of my classes, and someone, without knowing who it really was at the time yet, had put a small little pamphlet by close to the table that I was at. Had a Star of David on it. It was just a small little pamphlet. And I turned around and I said, "Who gave this to me?" And no one said anything about it. So as the professor is giving his lecture, I began to thumb through it. But when I came to the name of You Know Who, I immediately closed the booklet. And I said to myself, I was born a Jew and I will die a Jew. And I remember what my mother said, to stay away from these Gentiles because they will try to convert you to Christianity. And it's because of Jesus that all these atrocities have occurred for years. Pogroms, the Crusades, the Holocaust, etc. But as I completed that particular class, I made a beeline to the exit door because I wanted to get out of there as soon as I could. And so I stuck the little pamphlet in my pocket, and as I made an exit to the exit door, there was these two young men, 20s, who were much taller than I and much stronger than I. And although I was working at Jacqueline Health Spa at the time, working my way through college, these fellows were on the track team and were weightlifters. And they said, "We're the ones that put that pamphlet on your table." And I said, "Why?" "Because we know you're Jewish and we know who the Messiah is." And I said, "What?" These two young college students asked me a question, and they said, "If the Messiah was to come today, how would you recognize him?" Well, I didn't have an answer to that question, but I remember as a child going through Hebrew school that I was told that the Messiah that was to come would be like King David, a person, or it could be a messianic age, a time, or it could be an animal. But it certainly was not Jesus at all. In fact, I remember when I was right around the same time when these kids said what they did to me as a Christ killer and a Jew boy, it wasn't shortly after that I came home and I happened to mention that name in error, and my mother slapped me across the face, and it left a red mark on my cheek for a couple days.
Wow.
And so I remembered that anybody who wanted to talk to me about these things, and that was the first and the only time anybody ever tried to tell me or share with me that they believed that Jesus was the Messiah, or Yahshua, or Yeshua.
Mm-hmm.
So, as it turned out, I said to them, just as I alluded to earlier, I am a Jew, I was born a Jew, I will die a Jew, and I don't need your Jesus. And so I left.
Mm.
Well, curiosity got the best of me, and I dug out again the Masoretic text as to finding out the answer to the question that they had asked me if the Messiah was to come today, how would I recognize him? I went to the rabbi and I asked him the same question. I said, you don't need to ask that question. When the Messiah comes, the Messiah will come. I said, well, these people are telling me that they believe that Jesus is the Messiah. Don't believe them. They're cuckoo. They're nuts. They're meshubbats. Don't listen to them. Listen to me. I will give you spiritual advice. And that was the end of it. So these young fellows found out that I don't know how these people found out, but they found out that I worked at Jacqueline Hill Spa. And they said, why don't you come to our house? We can do some weightlifting together in the backyard. And I said, well, if I do come, I don't want to hear that name being brought up or you trying to share anything that you think is, in your opinion, right. And they agreed. So I got over there and had a wonderful workout time. And they said, well, why don't we go inside and get a glass of lemonade? So we went inside, sat down, and there was a gentleman sitting in the corner, which I assume was their father, reading from a book, and the outside of the book was black in color. I didn't know what he was reading. And he said, young man, may I read something for you? I said, well, sir, it's your house. You can read whatever you want to read. So then he proceeded, without me really knowing, he was reading from the 53rd chapter of Isaiah, which talks about the suffering servant. And at the end of the chapter, he asked me, who do you think this is talking about? Well, I remember as a child that the 53rd chapter of Isaiah is passed over. It is not a text that is read as part of the regular readings in the synagogue. And I always wondered why, but I just didn't have the chutzpah to ask the rabbi. Uh-huh. I just assumed since they were the spiritual advisors that they had all the answers. And I said, well, I don't know. And he goes, well, this is talking about your Jewish Messiah. I said, what do you mean it's talking about the Jewish Messiah hasn't even come yet? Yes, this is a prophecy of the coming of the Messiah. Well, certainly it might be a prophecy, but the Messiah hasn't come yet. He said, well, what if I could show you in your own scriptures that the Messiah who was prophesied about has already come? I said, well, that's impossible. My rabbi and everything I've learned about from Judaism has taught me that the Messiah has not come yet. Well, he began to write down a variety of different scriptures or texts from the Hebrew Tanakh. And he said, I want you to look these up. And I want you to write down questions. And I want you to ask your rabbi what he thinks about these particular scriptures. So he wrote them all down, And then I made the mistake when he said, the Father, I would like to give you the Bible. I said, well, I already have the Bible. No, I'm talking about the entire Bible. I said, you mean you're talking about the New Covenant? Yes. I said, well, I can't read that. It's a forbidden book. And if my parents find out, or my family finds out that I'm even contemplating reading the other book that I was told was the Christian Bible, I would be shunned from my family. So just read it. Keep an open mind. So he gave it to me, and it was the winter of 1975, and I was still living with my parents at the time, going through college. And I came home, and I was trying to figure out, how am I going to get this Bible into the house without my mother and father asking me about what it is. So I came home, and I tucked it underneath my jacket, and I came in and made a beeline to my bedroom and stuck the Bible underneath my bed mattress. After I did my homework that night, it was probably late into the wee hours of the morning, I dug out the Bible, and for the first time, I opened the New Covenant, the book of Matthew, and I began to read the genealogy. But when I came to you-know-whose name, I closed the book, and I didn't want to read any more about it. And so the next day, when I went to school, these young men approached me, and they said, well, did you look up some of those scriptures? I said, well, not entirely, no. And so I made an appointment with my rabbi, and I brought the list of the verses or scriptures or text that the father of these two boys gave me. And I brought a yellow pad with me, and I even had the Tanakh with me. And I went to the rabbi, and I said, Rabbi, I was here once before, and these young boys, their father gave me this sheet of paper, and I was wondering if you could help me understand what these are really talking about. Well, he didn't really want to get into it. I think that he perhaps felt inadequate, but because he was a rabbi, he didn't want to look like a complete fool. So he said, I will get back to you. So he took the piece of paper, and I went my way. So I just couldn't get out of my mind that if what these people were telling me was true, why haven't I heard it? In other words, if Jesus really was the Messiah, why didn't my rabbi or anybody else say anything to me about it? Especially since we as Jewish people, many do not believe that Jesus is Messiah and that they're still coming for the waiting of a Mashiach. I then began my spiritual search of the scriptures. So I dug out the Masoretic text, the Tanakh, and of course I had the entire Bible, and I started doing a comparison of some of the verses or scriptures that the Father had given me written down, and I looked up every single one of them in the Tanakh, and I found them, and I read them. And then on a yellow pad, I wrote down questions, and then I went to the New Covenant, although I didn't want to read it, but I began to see that it was very much a Jewish book. All the authors of the New Covenant are Jewish, except for perhaps Luke the doctor. And I thought, this is awfully strange. Why would a Christian Bible have all these Jewish authors in it? And why would a Christian Bible have all these Jewish names in it? So I was dumbfounded, but I was afraid to tell my rabbi or my parents that I was even beginning to read the New Covenant. But it took about a year's search going through the scriptures to realize I was in trouble. Because when I went to the Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, I realized, you know what? There's no more animal sacrifices. Herod's temple was destroyed around 70 A.D. Yeah. So how can I be forgiven of my sins if there's no sacrificial animal being sacrificed for my sins? And I realized that I was in trouble, because if Jesus really was or is or who he said he was, and I believed in him, I would no longer be Jewish anymore. That was my biggest fear. And the fact that I would be shunned from my family and most likely asked never to come back to the house again. And so there was a lot of fear, and I kept putting it off, knowing that, if I did this, I would be ashamed, or my mother and father would just be aghast by the decision that I had made. Well, after the year of search and asking lots of questions and going back and forth with the rabbi, I finally got on my knees for the first time in my life to pray, because in most cases Jewish people do not get on their knees and pray. And I began to weep like a little baby. I was just crying uncontrollably. And I began to confess and tell God I was sorry for the sins that I had committed. And I needed forgiveness. I wanted forgiveness. I wanted to be cleansed from all unrighteousness. And I knew that going to Yom Kippur wasn't good enough to forgive me of my sins. And I finally came to the realization that Yeshua, or Yahshua, is the long-awaited promised Jewish Messiah. So I don't remember all the details of my prayer, but from what I can understand, it was the first time that I had had a personal encounter with God, especially since this prayer was from my own heart and not a liturgy book of prayers. So I slept soundly that night. I awoke the next morning, and I was so refreshed and renewed. It was like I had slept for several days. And I awoke, and I just felt like something had happened to me. I just didn't quite understand what did. I didn't know about the fact that there'd be a newness of life or a change of life. So I went to school that day, and I met up with these young fellas, and I told them what happened, and they were just so happy. They were absolutely ecstatic. And of course, they wanted me to be baptized, and I said, no, I'm not going to do that. In fact, I said, I'm very hesitant even to tell my family what I've done. Uh-huh. This is quite a change.
Right.
And I, again, was very fearful that if I went any further into this, I would lose my Jewishness. That was one of the biggest fears that I had. And I didn't want to lose my Jewishness. I was born and raised in a religious Jewish upbringing. Everything that I understood as a child surrounded around the religion of Judaism. I would say 98% of my friends were all Jewish. And so I can imagine if I had told anybody what I had done, I would be outcast. Well, they assured me, they being the two young college students, they assured me that what I had done was right. And it was a decision that I made. I was of a certain age that I made a decision of my own. And so it took about 9 months later to finally tell my mother and father. And let me paint the picture for you.
Wow.
I was secretly going to an assembly or a temple or a church, if you want to use that word. And I was secretly reading the scriptures, and I was beginning to see changes in my life that I had never seen before. I, unfortunately, was very heavily involved. I hate to even admit this, but I was heavily involved in pornography at the time. And when the change occurred in my life, everything changed. My swearing changed, smoking changed, alcohol changed, pornography changed. I just saw things in my life that began to change because I realized that it was wrong and that I didn't have to wait once a year to go to the day of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, to be forgiven of my sins. So imagine I'm coming home. I'm still living with my parents, going through college. I come home, and my mother is sitting on the couch reading the newspaper. And my father was in the kitchen. He was a counselor for Hotline. It was where people who wanted to commit suicide, and he was trying to talk them out of it. So anyways, I came in, and I knew what I had to tell them. And I knew what was going to happen when I told them. And so I said, Mom, Dad, I have some good news and I have some bad news. And typical Jewish mother, wait, what's going on? What happened to you? What happened to you? And so I sat down. My father put the phone down. He came into the living room. And I said, well, it's good news for me, but it's going to sound bad news to you. And I just blurted it out. And I said, I have come to believe that Yahshua, or Jesus, is the long-awaited promised Jewish Messiah. Well, my mother shrieked, and my father was all upset, and they made an appointment with the rabbi immediately. We all went over there, and it was 3 against 1, the same rabbi that I had gone to and talked to numerous times. And they said that I was a meshugana, I was crazy, and that what I believed in was wrong. You've been brainwashed. You have no idea what you've done. You're no longer Jewish anymore. If you believe in this, you will be shunned from your family. You'll never be allowed to come to the synagogue anymore. You're no longer Jewish. So stop believing in this nonsense. Well, I knew what I had done. It was real. I saw the changes in my life. I knew that I did not have a religious experience. It was more of a spiritual experience, a spiritual transformation. I hadn't accepted some new religion, but I had come to believe that Yeshua, not only is the Messiah, but is the deliverer. And so my mother and father said that I wouldn't be able to stay there at the house anymore. And so I stayed with the young college students at their house, and they began to help me understand what the scriptures were talking about. And it was very difficult, because of all the training I went through Hebrew school, to recognize or realize that they had something that I wanted, but they didn't know what I had gone through as a child. They didn't know the names that I had been called. They didn't know my upbringing. They didn't quite understand all the traditionalism of Judaism. And I didn't want to lose any of that. And so I spoke with the spiritual advisor or pastor, and I explained to him what I was going through. And he said, you haven't lost your Jewishness. You can't lose the identity of being a Jewish person. And in fact, you are now completed in your faith. And I go, well, what do you mean? You haven't converted. You've been completed. In other words, everything about Christianity and Judaism is blended into each other. Everything that's written about in the scriptures of the Messiah to come is very much Jewish. So if I believed in the Jewish Messiah and I believed that Yeshua was the Messiah, how could I lose my Jewishness? And so for the first time, I realized that the decision I had made couldn't alter the fact that I was born and raised in a Jewish family. I would always be Jewish regardless, and I couldn't lose it. Well, as a result of all this, I began to grow in my spiritual walk. And for the first time in my life, I could honestly say that now I had a relationship, a personal relationship. I could go to God at any time. I didn't have to wait for the Shabbat or to read from a prayer book. I could come to God all throughout the day and pray. I could read the scriptures anytime. I didn't have to wait till the reading of the Torah and the traditional Shabbat Sabbath day of reading from the Torah. I could read anytime I wanted to. So I began to realize that, you know what? I haven't lost my Jewishness. If anything, I am more Jewish now than I was before because I understand how it all ties together. So this
Wonderful.
was probably one of the most earth-shaking things that happened in my life, and I've never looked back as a result of it. Now, I do have to admit that my family did shun me. I was never allowed to go back to the synagogue. However, what I did was I waited a year, and I wanted to go back to see the rabbi one more time to let him know that beyond a shadow of a doubt, what I had experienced was real, and what the scriptures talk about are true, that the Messiah has already come. So I set up the appointment. I went to the synagogue. I had my yellow pad. I had my Tanakh. I had the entire Bible. And he knew I was coming. I came inside, and I said, Rabbi, I want to share something with you. And I shared my story. And he said I was crazy. I was a mashugana. I didn't know what I was talking about. The same thing that he had said before. I'm the rabbi. You don't know anything. And you're crazy for even believing in this stuff. And I said, well, if I'm so crazy, then why is it true? And I said, you have never explained to me what these scriptures meant, but now I'm beginning to understand what they really are. And so he asked me to, not too kindly though, he asked me to leave his office and never come back to the synagogue again. Mm-hmm. And if he ever found me there, he would kick me out.
Wow.
So I never saw the rabbi again, ever after that. And then I began to live with another individual, and things began to change. And my life started to, I really saw some miracles and wonders.
Can you share a little bit about that? A miracle?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So I was about 23 years old, and my father called me, and he said, I don't know how to say this, but I need your prayers. And I said, well, what's wrong, Dad? Well, Grandma is at Cedar Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles, California. She's in the intensive care, and they have diagnosed her with stage 4 cancer of the pancreas. And I know I shouldn't even be calling you to do this, but I need your prayers. I said, well, Dad, let's go over there and see her. Yeah, but here's the thing. You can't mention that name. I said, well, Dad, I believe in miracles. I believe that anything can happen if we just believe. So my father and I went to Cedar Sinai, and we got to the hospital. My grandmother was in intensive care, just as my father said. She looked like a Holocaust survivor. She was in stage 4. The doctor said there is no hope for your grandmother. She'll die within 30 days or less, and there is no way that she's going to get any better. So we're basically just going to put her in hospice, and that's that. And I said to them, I believe that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob can heal my grandmother. I said, what are you talking about? We're the doctor. I'm the doctor. You don't know what you're talking about. I said, well, I do. So my grandmother did not know what I believed in because my father never told her. So I said, Dad, you asked me to pray for grandmother. I'm here. So I'm going to take her hand, and I'm going to ask God to do a supernatural experience here. And he said, well, don't mention that name. I said, well, Dad, I'm sorry, but I am going to mention that name. And so in the presence, it was so crystal clear. I was in intensive care. I had my grandmother's hand in my hand. My father was opposite me, and at the bed of the end of the bed in the hospital there was the doctor and 2 nurses. And I said, we're going to pray. And no one said anything about not wanting me to pray. And so I took my grandmother's hand, and I asked her, I said, Grandma, if you have just a little bit of faith to believe that God can miraculously heal you, and squeeze my hand. And she did. And so I began to pray. And I believed without a doubt in my mind that God could heal my grandmother. And I ended my prayer in Yeshua's name. And my father and I left. And I told my father, I said, there was no question in my mind. God has already healed Grandma. Well, he didn't say anything about it. But the next day, he called me, and he was very excited. He said, you're not going to believe this. And I said, well, what's that? The doctors have said that they can't find the cancer in Grandma's body, so they're going to fatten her up a little bit and send her home.
Awesome.
My grandmother was miraculously healed. In fact, she lived another 22 years after that. She was already 74 years old. I'm sorry, she was 72 years old when it happened. So she lived to the ripe age of 94 years of age.
Wow, that's so awesome.
Well, as a result of all this, I have to back up to preface this by saying that when my father had called me, he goes, now, Alan, I want to make a deal with God. I said, what do you mean? Well, I'll believe in your Jesus if God heals Grandma. I said, Dad, it doesn't quite work that way, okay? If God wants to heal Grandma, then God will heal Grandma. Okay, it's not me. It's God himself. Well, long story short, my father and my grandmother both came to believe as I did.
Awesome.
And so I got a very large print Bible from my grandmother because she had a very bad eyesight. And so my faith was absolutely, just went to another level when I saw the miraculous healing of my grandmother. Mm-hmm. And it just told me nothing is impossible for God. And so as I began to mature as a believer in Yeshua as my Messiah, I began to tell others about it as well. And I went to every single family member face to face to share with them what happened to me.
That's wonderful.
Not many of them. Many of them, of course, didn't want anything to do with me after that. Mm-hmm. But you know what? I did what I had to do, and I'm not ashamed that I did it. And they know, those who are still alive, they know what happened to me, and they've seen the change in my life. But you know, Liliana, there's a price to pay to believe in Yeshua. Mm-hmm. And for a Jewish person to be completed in his faith, it's a big step. It's a huge step, because it means that you're going to lose a lot of things. Your family's not going to be very happy. They're going to shun you. They don't want you to come to any of the activities or things that they do, because you'll be talking about your belief in Yeshua as a Messiah. So it was a very difficult time in my life to go through all that, but it's been worth it, every moment of it. So that is what happened to me. For anybody who's listening to this, I know beyond a shadow of a doubt what you are going through. If you're a Jewish person and you're listening to this, and I know you are, otherwise you wouldn't be hearing this, I'm one of more than 450,000 Jewish people in this modern era that have made a profession of faith and believe beyond a shadow of a doubt that Yeshua is the long-awaited promised Jewish Messiah. And you can have forgiveness of your iniquities, your transgressions, your sins. It's not the blood of an animal. It's the blood of a divine being. So my challenge to any Jewish person that's listening to this is search the scriptures, open the Tanakh, ask questions, write them down, even go to your rabbi, read the 53rd chapter of Isaiah over and over again, and understand that in this one chapter alone, backing up to a few verses in chapter 52 of Isaiah, there are 54 masculine pronouns used in this text: him, he, his, he, etc. This is not talking about the nation of Israel. This is talking about a suffering servant who I believe is the Messiah, who I believe is Yeshua. So I challenge every one of you to quiet yourself, to have a private prayer, to ask God to open up your eyes as you read the scriptures. And I challenge you to ask yourself this very, very important question, as I was asked over 35 years ago. If the Messiah was to come today, how would you recognize him?
God's going to answer you.
Amen.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it, and we hope that you'll be back to do another show. We can share some more of those amazing miracles that Yeshua did for you and that he can do for those who are listening.
Amen. I'm looking forward to it myself.
Thank you for listening to Tikvah Radio Show, the voice of hope. If you have been blessed by this program and want to join us in sharing with others the hope of Yeshua HaMashiach, a gift of any amount will be appreciated. You can donate and contact us on our website at tikvahradio.com. Once again, that's TIKVAH radio.com. Thank you for joining us, and God bless.